Hear the word of the Lord from Luke chapter 17, verses 11 through 19. On the way to Jerusalem, he was passing along between Samaria and Galilee. And as he entered a village, he was met by 10 lepers who stood at a distance and lifted up their voices and said, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, they were cleansed. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. And he fell on his face at Jesus' feet, giving him thanks. Now he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus said, "Were not 10 cleansed? Where are the 9? Was no one found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" And he said to him, "Rise and go your way. Your faith has saved you." May God bless the reading of His Word. You may be seated. It really has been a treat this semester in chapel. The faculty presentations have been outstanding. And each week it seems the faculty has been modeling very well for the students how to preach, how to move from text to a word for the church. And so I intend this morning to offer you an example of what you shouldn't do. And that is wing it. That's what I'm working. Actually, as I was preparing this, I found myself to be really jealous. You know, Dr. Peterson had the shrewd servant, the shrewd manager. Dr. Napier had this amazing parable. Dr. Stanglin had to consult the sources to deal with the mulberry tree. I had to consult sources to find something to say beyond the text. I feel like one could read this text and sit down. It's pretty clear. And I see Dr. Shopper is nodding. And so that was good. Well, what's going on in the background here is, as Dr. Stanglin pointed out last week, our text finds itself in the narrative of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem. Along the way, the disciples have asked an incredibly dangerous and some might think stupid question or petition. "Lord, increase our faith." Be careful when you pray that prayer. They've received the discourse about a mulberry tree, about an unworthy servant who, I would suggest, demonstrates his faith by being about his master's business. The hero of the story, of course, is Jesus. But there is another character in this story we ought to consider imitating: the Samaritan. Luke is fascinated by the outsider, the one who travels apart from what Israel expects. There has been the Good Samaritan already in Luke, and now we come to the Sick Samaritan, or maybe the Grateful Samaritan, or perhaps even more appropriately, the Believing Samaritan. Let's just explore the characters of this text. First you have Jesus. Jesus' journey to Jerusalem is really odd. It's like traveling from Houston to El Paso by route of Brownsville. He goes into weird areas that you wouldn't expect. It's not a direct route, but why? I think sometimes we pass too easily and too quickly through details of the text. And notice what Luke says. Jesus is passing through the area between Samaria and Galilee. And Jesus is at the border, in the no man's land. His mission to Jerusalem, to which he set his face earlier in Luke, would be a whole lot quicker if he didn't let all this ministry get in the way. And so Jesus finds himself and places himself on this tempestuous border between two disparate cultures and all of the racial and social tensions between them. And there Jesus ministers. And the results, as usual in Luke, ought to shock us. And finding faith in a region like this would be like finding a team in Burnt Orange playing to its potential. All right, it happened this weekend, and I wrote this before this weekend, so anyway. Well, what about the 10? The lepers come to Jesus, and at least in Jesus they recognize a powerful prophet. They cry out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And note Jesus' response. It's not, "Be healed." Unlike the previous leper in Luke, Jesus doesn't reach and touch them. He simply says, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." Well, why a priest, first of all? And I consulted an excellent commentary for this, and that's David Garland's commentary in the Zondervan series. And he points out that a priest couldn't heal leprosy, but was responsible instead for diagnosis. The priest declared one to have a dreadful skin condition. It also allowed them then to enter back into normal society, to reclaim a normal life once the conditions were dealt with. But it seems to me we shouldn't overlook the seed of faith that is present in all 10 of the lepers. We know what's coming next, we've just read that, but we shouldn't too quickly jump over it. Jesus says, "Go, see the priests," and the lepers go, without question. They must accept His words, they must act on them in faith, and in fact, they do. And it works. Glory be. On the way to the priests, sure enough, the disease is taken from them. All that remains for them to return to their normal lives is certification by a priest. And then there is the one. For one of them sees more. Garland also points out that he echoes almost exactly the response of the shepherds to the announcement of the angels at Jesus' birth, for he sees his healing. He turns back and he praises God. For his faith is in much more than a prophet. This one leper appropriately recognizes who Jesus is, and he falls upon his face, an unworthy and a grateful servant. But Luke, as usual, offers us an offhand remark, sort of dropping it, and it slaps us in the face. And by the way, he was a Samaritan. Luke likes to keep these cards up his sleeve. Maybe he wants us to give us a clean impression of the unclean leper to kick the story off. One can imagine the life of a leper Samaritan living at the border between Galilee and Samaria. This was a doubly, maybe triply cursed man. He is unclean as a leper. He is unclean as a Samaritan. And he finds himself at the border, the margins of both Jewish and Samaritan society. He is utterly outcast. It seems as though maybe the disease had torn down some of the racial barriers between himself and his companions, but one imagines that he still remained only marginally one of them. And yet, he is the character in the story, the only one who expresses real faith. And in doing so, he serves as the example for the disciples who pray to Jesus, "Increase our faith." Be careful what you ask for. And Jesus recognizes the irony and the power of this moment. He drives home the point. Is it really only this outsider, this allogenes, this other-born? And it is the faith of this outsider. And not only the faith that acts in self-interest, the faith that's willing to go and see the priest, but the faith that's willing to give up the return to normal society in order to return to Jesus in sacrificial gratitude. That is the faith that Jesus says saves. He uses the term, "Your faith has saved you," 4 times in Luke. Twice of women, once of a blind Jewish man, and once of a Samaritan leper. All unlikely recipients, as the kingdom gates are thrown open to all who come. Well, there are a couple of, maybe 3 insights for us. maybe more. Dr. Weed taught us early on to look for a word of judgment and a word of grace, and certainly we find those in this text. There is a word of judgment for us. There is a word of judgment for our culture. And Dr. Stanglin mentioned last week that we live in an entitlement culture where we feel we are owed. What would this parable or this story look like were it to take place today in modern America? One can imagine that the lepers wouldn't use the word master, but one wonders if there would be any sense of thanksgiving. We've lost gratitude in our culture. Often in our churches it's the same. How many times do we remember to thank God for all of the blessings in our lives? For the rain, for another day, for our families, for our joys, for our pains, for our struggles. We must remember, I think, as Christians, that saving faith, the faith that Jesus says has saved us, is grateful faith. A faith that answers God's providential care with the recognition of who God is and what He's done. I wondered as I worked on this, so did their leprosy come back? You know, you go back, it would be kind of like karmic, right? Okay, joking about that, but it's a tragic story because the lepers receive healing, but not the real healing on offer. The lepers couldn't see the radical transformation and the faith required for that real healing. And the question for the church today is, can we? But there is a great word of grace in this text. For many of us find ourselves or have found ourselves at the border, wondering about our place in God's plan. And the Word of God comes to us no matter who we are. We aren't kept from the saving actions of Christ because of our race or our social status. We aren't limited by the artificial barriers set up by the world around us. And Jesus calls us, all of us, to discipleship. And we are given the freedom, no matter who we are, to respond in gratitude. The message of the gospel is liberating for those who find themselves on the outside, at the margins. Those of us who believe we're too lost in sin to return to the healing Christ. I once knew a man who refused to take communion on Sunday mornings, and I finally worked up the courage to ask him about this, knowing he had been baptized. He responded, he didn't because he was a sinner. But Jesus' message to those whom society or themselves or whoever sees as too far gone for grace is that it takes a sinner to be a Christian. But finally, and one that I think we might often, a word for us that we might often not hear from the text, is a word of mission. Dr. Napier has said before, we often read the Gospels as if we're spectators watching the events unfold. We may try to identify with the characters in the stories, with the Samaritan or the tax collectors or the lepers or the disciples. But remember that Jesus' call to the disciples and to us as well is to follow. Perhaps then when we read the Gospels, we ought to look at what Jesus does and do the same. And where is Jesus? He's at the border. He's among the outcasts. He's ministering to the despised, the rejected. Indeed, He allows His progress toward His mission to be interrupted for genuine ministry. And He calls us to live our lives as He does, to sow the seeds of faith in unlikely places, to minister to those whom the world and often even the church considers outcasts, unlikely recipients of God's grace. He calls us as ministers to not be so caught up in our missions that we keep ourselves from engaging in real ministry. I sang with a quartet a few years back, and one of our members was our youth minister, and he was doing a VBS for the summer, so we were out driving around town, some of you know this story, and delivering flyers to various churches about our VBS. And as we were driving past a broken down car on Holland Street, which is where I go to church, Holland Street, and so maybe 6 blocks from my church, I saw a car broken down on the side of the road. And it was August in Texas. And we were driving by, very comfortably dressed, had a show that night, but we're all right. And my brother says, "Hey, should we stop and help this guy?" And I drove past him and said, "Nah, we're doing the Lord's work." That evening we had a show, and we left the house, very well dressed, ready for our show. And we were driving out of our neighborhood, and those of you who have been there know it's a long way back up in there. And we ran out of gas. And we had to walk about 2.5 miles, and cars kept passing us. And the whole way I'm thinking, okay, Lord, I understand. Don't be so caught up in the mission that you lose what real ministry is. Indeed, may God grant us the ability to see the Lord's work among the people whose eyes of faith may be opened, whose faith will save them. May we, unworthy servants, do what we're tasked with doing, ignoring the false borders of the world and reaching the broken with God's all-consuming grace. May we turn back and may we worship. May we be grateful.